Welcome to Military Analytics. The world always revolves around the order in which the strong try to suppress the weak. Some continents of the modern world have managed to live peacefully away from this behavior for many years, especially Scandinavian and Baltic countries have been in this position for a long time. Europe also developed its peaceful behavior after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, and other European countries were unitedly protected from the Soviet mentality and oppression under the just roof of NATO and the USA. However, Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine triggered many chain reactions in the world. Everything changed with the entry of Vladimir Putin's armies into Ukraine. Europe, the Scandinavian geography, the Baltics, and the United States began to take critical measures against Russia's aggressive policies and threats. One of the strongest trump cards in the current world is the economy. Economic reactions can plunge a country into internal turmoil, popular revolts, and economic crises. The economic crisis and sanctions will degrade the target country's military industry and can seriously reduce its ability to fight. This puts the targeted country under a great deal of pressure and can bring that country under the yoke of the sanctioning country in every field. World superpower countries such as Russia, the United States of America, and China hate to be under each other's economic, military, and political yoke. They hate even more the sanction trump card of a much smaller country. Vladimir Putin fell into exactly this position with his aggressive policies. In addition to the heavy sanctions imposed on Russia by powerful countries such as the USA, UK, and France, Russia received one of the biggest economic blows from Belgium. The Belgian government has frozen at least $250 billion worth of Russian assets since the start of the war. That's a huge number and extremely remarkable. The Russian government tried to put pressure on Belgium and the EU in this regard, but Russia's efforts were completely fruitless. Belgium even went further and pressed the button to use the interest income from the Russian assets to help Ukraine. Belgium plans to use all 180 billion euros of interest from frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine's recovery. The country's Prime Minister, Alexander Kroes, made the announcement at a joint press conference with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in The Hague. In March, Belgium decided to send some of the interest on the tax on frozen assets to support Ukraine. But now the country's government wants to use all the interest received. He also noted that Belgium is ready to play a leading role in supporting the restoration of Ukraine at the European Commission. According to the Belgian Ministry of Finance, 58 billion euros of Russian assets were frozen and 191 billion euros of Russian financial transactions were also blocked. It was stated that as a result of the taxation of the interest from the frozen 250 billion Russian financial assets, a total of 625 million euros were transferred to the Belgian Treasury. Thus, Belgium broke the record for freezing Russian assets. At the same time, there are no tangible assets such as real estate or yachts among the Russian assets frozen from Belgium. Goods detained by customs authorities at the port of Antwerp are an exception. Thus, Belgium paralyzed the Russian economy, and as a result, the power and prestige of Russia and Vladimir Putin in the international arena dwindled horribly. The total number of sanctions imposed on Russia is over 14,000. With this number, Russia surpassed all the countries of the world. The United States is one of the countries that imposes the most sanctions on Russia. On the other hand, another country that attracted attention with 774 sanctions was Switzerland. However, Belgian data on sanctions against Russia recently overshadowed all these calculations. In short, according to the Belgian Treasury, Brussels has become the leader in Europe in this indicator, which includes the sanctions of Russian assets. It was also among the information that some representatives of the Russian business world transferred their assets to their relatives in order to avoid sanctions. This was reported by Belgium to the European Commission, which added new names and entities to its sanctions list. Answering a question about the possibility of transferring frozen assets to Ukraine, Digest noted that the Belgian constitution and European treaties protect frozen Russian properties. He added that the move would require regulation at the European level. Also, according to a document from the European Commission, the European Union is examining possible options for using and returning the foreign currency reserves frozen in the bloc countries of the Russian Central Bank. Therefore, the EU can divert profits from investments resulting from the freezing of Russian assets to finance the restoration of Ukraine. The bloc's member states formed a working group last month to explore options. Swedish diplomat Anders Omlid, who leads the group, told the newspaper that he agreed that the EU's actions should be in line with the EU and international law. In line with this statement, the working group of the bloc's member states believes that after a certain period of time, the Bank of Russia will be able to prove its arguments in favor of investing its assets and making profits in favor of Ukraine. Flash data was also shared from the European Commission on the freezing of Russian assets. Ursula von, President of the European Commission, announced that after Russia's special operation in Ukraine, Western countries blocked the €300 billion reserve of the Central Bank of the Russian Federation and the €19 billion special fund of Russian businessmen. According to Russian Finance Minister Anton Siluanov, Russia has lost access to half of its gold and foreign exchange reserves, about $300 billion. The European Commission, on the other hand, stated that the blocked funds should be collected in a fund, the fund should be invested, and the profits from these investments should be used for compensatory payments to Ukraine. There was no delay in the response from the Moscow authorities regarding the freezing of Russian assets due to Russia's invasion against Ukraine. Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary of the President of the Russian Federation, claimed that the blocking of assets abroad is against international law. These statements of the Kremlin spokesman, in fact, most clearly revealed this critical situation for Russia because the Russians could not predict that Europe would act in line with a single purpose against the occupation of Ukraine. This reaction after the invasion of Ukraine for unfair reasons will drag both the Moscow administration and the Russian economy into a complete bottleneck in the defense industry. Serious collapses are expected in Russia due to the sanctions as a result, due to Russia's military operation in Ukraine. The West increased its sanctions against Russia and many European companies withdrew from the Russian market. The European Union has imposed 10 packages of sanctions against Russia since February last year. Russian President Vladimir Putin has previously stated that the policy of containing and weakening Russia is a long-term strategy for the West and that the sanctions deal a serious blow to the entire global economy. But these plans of the Russian leader do not seem to make Europe withdraw its sanctions decisions. The steps to be taken by Russia in this regard are eagerly awaited, especially considering that we have entered the spring period and we will see an increase in clashes in the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia will be severely restrained by this heavy economic blow. In this critical time period, Ukraine's military and financial support from the West will play a prominent role in the course of the war. In fact, this is exactly what we're talking about all the time. Yes, when we look at it, Ukraine has much more limited resources than Russia, both economically and militarily. But since the beginning of the war, Western and U.S. sanctions against Russia and military aid to the Ukrainian army have taken the Ukrainians a few steps beyond the Russians in the war. Therefore, the Russians suffer heavy losses on the front lines due to the sanctions they have received in the economic and diplomatic fields. Because it is impossible for even the soldiers and commanders in the Russian army to continue this war without basic needs. As a result, this chain-like cycle causes Russia, which has one of the most powerful armies in the world, to melt away on the territory of Ukraine. In other words, the continuation of the Western and U.S. sanctions against Russia will leave Russia much weaker in this war of attrition. Ukraine, on the other hand, will do its part and strike the final blow in order to end the war when the time comes. Tensions rise on the southern and eastern fronts of the Ukrainian war, and the Russian army is beginning to lose control and offensive capability. The intensity of the clashes between the two armies has increased considerably in recent weeks. Russian casualties have been massive this week as the Ukrainian military's war effort has continued to escalate. Particular advances of the Russian army in Bakhmut, which hosted the most important conflicts of the Eastern Front, were lost thanks to the efforts of the Ukrainian army after the supply of ammunition that the Ukrainian army expected from its Western partners, especially the Ukrainian mechanized brigades, managed to push back the Russians. Let's examine together the latest developments in the Ukrainian war and what happened on the front lines. The Ukrainian army continues to inflict huge losses on the Russian army with a successful offensive operations. Over the past day, the Ukrainian Air Force struck Russian clusters 8 times, while Ukrainian rocket and artillery forces struck the positions of the Russians' S-300 air defense system and 3 air warfare stations. The most notable among the Russian losses was the S-300 air defense system. The cost of the S-300 long-range air defense complex is more than $115 million. The Ukrainian army has so far managed to destroy more than a dozen S-300s, especially after last August. The effectiveness of the Russian S-300 air defense systems decreased since then. The S-300 air defense systems have become easy targets for the Ukrainian army. As AGM-88 anti-radiation missiles can now be used by the Ukrainian military. American-made AGM-88 anti-radar missiles were integrated into Ukrainian fighter jets, and within a range of more than 100 kilometers they neutralized the radars of the Russian air defense system. The Russian army continues to focus its main efforts on offensive operations in the Lyman-Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka directions. Ukrainian defense forces repelled more than 35 Russian attacks in these areas. Russian troops carried out more than 36 attacks in addition to 2 missile and 34 airstrikes using MLR systems. But none of these attacks were successful. Ukrainian General Staff continues its warnings to the civilian population as the possibility of more Russian missiles and airstrikes on Ukrainian soil is high. According to the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the operational situation in the Policia, Civil Engineer, and Slobozhenszchina directions did not undergo significant changes, as no signs of the formation of any offensive groupings were detected. 6 settlements in the Sumy region and 6 settlements in the Kharkiv region were exposed to Russian bombardment. In addition, 9 settlements in the Kharkiv region were hit by Russian artillery in the direction of Lyman. The Russians launched unsuccessful offensive operations in the area south of 2 important settlements, the settlement from the Kharkiv region. 4 settlements from the Luhansk region and 4 settlements from the Donetsk region were hit by Russian artillery in the direction of Bakhmut. Russian troops continue their attack, trying to take full control of the city of Bakhmut, where the war continues. During the day, Russian troops conducted unsuccessful offensive operations in the Bohdanivka area. Nearly 10 Russian attacks on the specified section of the front line were repelled by the Ukrainian defense forces. 12 settlements from the Donetsk region, including Bakhmut, were affected by the Russian bombardment in the Avdiivka and Marinka regions. The Russian army had no gains in its offensive efforts in the 4 settlements. The most fierce fighting on the indicated part of the front continues for Marinka, where the Ukrainian defenders repelled more than 10 Russian attacks. At the same time, the Russians bombed 11 settlements in the Donetsk region. The Russian army did not carry out any offensive operations in the direction of Shakhtarsk. At the same time, the Russian army bombed 8 settlements in the Donetsk region, including Volodar in the Zaporizhian and Kherson directions. Russian troops continued to form defensive lines and positions for further fortification. Settlements surrounding the battle line were hit by Russian artillery. Among the bombed, there are 2 settlements from the Donetsk region, 7 settlements from the Zaporizhia region, and 8 settlements, including Kherson. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, the Russian army continues to suffer significant losses. It has been determined that the graduations will be held, according to the previously planned schedule, at the facilities that train specialists for the military units of the Strategic Missile Forces, Airspace Forces, and the Navy. Ukrainian Air Defense Forces destroyed the Supercam reconnaissance drone operated by the Russian army in the Mykolaiv region. The offensive operations of the Ukrainian army are mostly aimed at Russia's advanced weapons systems and ammunition depots. The Ukrainian army, which wants to leave the Russian army unarmed and without ammunition and to break their already deep motivation, has largely achieved this goal. The shooting down of reconnaissance UAVs and electronic warfare systems such as Supercam are developments that will relieve the Ukrainian army in the upcoming offensive operations. Experts paid great attention to the analysis of the situation in the city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. Russian forces in the Bakhmut region use thermobaric artillery systems to Zana. According to experts, 1A thermobaric artillery systems can be received by the Russian Air Force, especially the 76th and 106th Guards Airborne Divisions. The armed forces could not confirm this information, but stated that such data could be obtained by intelligence officers through additional observation tools, primarily space images. At the same time, the reinforcement of the Russian troops in Bakhmut by paratroopers really happens. The Russians are strengthening their forces in Bakhmut with their own forces. The Wagner PMC sought to monopolize in this direction, even to create its own air and artillery units. The Eastern Forces Group has been reinforcing its units with regular Russian army units, including airborne troops, in recent weeks. So are the Russians really advancing in Bakhmut? Geographically located, videos confirm that Russian troops are advancing north of Bakhmut, north of the village of Kromov, 2 kilometers from the city, and 11 kilometers northeast of Orhovo-Vasilivka. Other images show Ukrainian forces advancing to positions west of Novobakhmutka and north of Avdiivka. However, it remains unclear whether the armed forces maintain their positions in these regions. Russian officials even say that Ukrainian soldiers left the city to avoid the siege. They reported that the mercenaries of the Wagner PMC had captured the school building west of the Metallurg Stadium in the center of Bakhmut. The Ukrainian side briefly comments on the situation in Bakhmut without giving details. The Department of Defense comments boiled down to a few key theses is the situation in the city is difficult. The armed forces of Ukraine remain in place. Ukraine needs even more Western weapons. During a visit to Warsaw, Vladimir Zelensky suggested the possibility of leaving Bakhmut to avoid the siege. But for now, the Ukrainian command believes that the possibility of withdrawal remains. Of course, at a moment of hotter events and there is a danger of losing personnel due to the siege. The Land Forces Command of the Armed Forces of Ukraine will have appropriate and correct decisions. Zelensky emphasized that the main issue for the Ukrainian ground forces, which are engaged in defending himself in Bakhmut, is to protect Ukrainian army. So how do thermobaric weapons work? The Ukrainian military has repeatedly reported that the Russians' heavy flame-throwing systems were destroyed a few months ago. The presidency reported that the armed forces had destroyed 9 TOS, 1 Buratino, and 1 Ason Kapek systems since the start of the large-scale war. The Russian Ministry of Defense does not hide that it uses these systems in the war against Ukraine. There they repeatedly boasted about the power and efficiency of flamethrower systems, and therefore emphasized that the armed forces of Ukraine organized a real hunt for these weapons. Santopark is a district-level military system, but its use will not give the Russian troops a decisive advantage. A thermobaric weapon, also known as a vacuum bomb or fuel air explosive, consists of a container containing 2 separate explosive charges. It can be launched as a rocket or dropped from an airplane as a bomb. As soon as it hits the target, the first charge of explosive opens the container and scatters the combustible material into a cloud. This cloud can enter any opening in buildings or fortifications that are not completely enclosed. Then a second charge cloud explodes, creating a massive fireball, a powerful blast wave, and a vacuum that absorbs all surrounding oxygen. It is no secret that the Russians use such weapons many times in the Ukrainian war. The systematic destruction of these weapons by the Ukrainian army is of great importance for the security of the Ukrainian soldiers. If the Ukrainian army does not destroy these weapons, it may suffer great losses, especially in the defensive lines. And this will negatively affect the course of the war on behalf of Ukraine. There are a lot of updates from the Zaporizhia region. Here, Ukrainians broke the long period of low activity by launching extensive artillery preparation on the closest Russian positions to the main Ukrainian strongholds. The artillery and airstrikes were immediately followed by a series of mechanized assaults, with the main goal of reducing the gray zone areas between Ukrainian and Russian forces and getting as close to Russian positions as possible. 2 days ago, Ukrainians started preparing for a number of assaults. They launched artillery preparation and shelled Russian positions in front of Robotan and Novokarlivka. Russian sources also reported about the Ukrainian use of aviation to complement their artillery efforts. After that, Ukrainians conducted 2 localized assaults. The first assault was launched in the direction of Poloi. Ukrainians reported La Paz, Bilohirya, and Novopokrovka and attempted to storm Russian fortifications near Levski and Novokarlivka. Russian sources reported that Ukrainians used at least 1 platoon supported by armor. The attack was unsuccessful and Russian forces pushed the Ukrainians back by using anti-tank systems and artillery support. The second attack was launched in the direction of Robotan. The available geolocated footage shows that Ukrainians assaulted an extensive trench network near the highway around 3 kilometers south of Novodane-Lover. Ukrainians used at least 2 platoons, also supported by several tanks, and tried to open several lines of attack, namely from the highway and also directly through the field. The video shows that Ukrainians managed to push Russians from the trenches in the middle of the field. But because their second group did not manage to get close from the side of the highway, the attack failed, and Ukrainians retreated. Russian sources were unanimously saying that if Ukrainians started launching similar assaults on other parts of the front line, then these two attacks near Robotan and Poloe mark the beginning of the preparation for the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation. And it seems like it is true because the next day Ukrainians launched two more assaults. The first assault happened near Novozlotopil, while the second one happened near Vasilyevka. Russian sources reported that these attacks were much lighter and that Ukrainians used several squads for conducting this reconnaissance in-force operations with artillery support. Russians also anticipated the resumption of attacks near Polo and Robotan because Russian trenches here were heavily shelled. Ukrainians also shelled Russian positions in completely different regions, such as near Myrna and Oryanika. They also used several assault helicopters to conduct airstrikes. Ukrainian officials, such as the head of the Secretary and Defense Council, stated many times that the next Ukrainian counter-offensive would likely be in the south. The increased activity along the whole Zaporizhia front line and voluntary imposition of positional fights by Ukrainians is a strong signal that Ukrainians are preparing for the promised big move in late spring or summer. Some Russian sources are cautiously warning that Ukrainians may just want Russians to think that this is what they intend to do. But so far, the actions make sense. At the moment, the Ukrainians are taking the most ambiguous areas where a lot of territories have been considered as gray zones, especially Bilohirya, Novopokrovka, but also the southern part of Kamiansk and the whole Huliipo line. Reduction of the gray zones and formulation of a clearer picture of the enemy positions is a necessity. Otherwise, launching a counteroffensive out of the blue will come at a high price. The element of surprise is useful, but when it comes to large-scale operations, a complete understanding of the situation on the ground and the development of a high level of coordination between the troops as a result of combat shakes down play significantly more important roles, especially when it is known that Russian forces have been building fortifications to complicate rapid Ukrainian advances. As seen from the map of fortifications, it is clear that Russians are anticipating the main attack to come near the Dnipro River. So the further it gets from the river, the fewer Russians have their fortifications. That is why Ukrainians are launching attacks everywhere and trying to reduce the gray zones along the entire southern front. Ukrainians will be able to evaluate their chances of each possible course of action and pick the most promising direction to deliver the main blow. But being aware of what is happening in multiple locations is important not only on the fronts.